I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Welcome to another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. In this one, we're going to take a little bit of time to unpack and maybe think about the last two, well, not interviews, because Cutrone actually gave a talk for the Maurin Academy on the 1848 revolutions, but sort of reflecting on what Chris Cutrone said in the about the 1848 revolutions in light of what John Rao had to say about the same time period and some of the same events, and from the Catholic traditional perspective. So two very different perspectives running around about the same time frame and same type of events, right? And so this ought to be an interesting conversation. Like I listened to both of them again. I didn't get quite all the way through the Rao interview. I got about like 80% through it. I listened to Chris's talk again. So anyway, like that's the plan. And we'll probably make part of this the secret Grange. So if you're really interested in hearing the remainder of the conversation, because there will be more, the way to hear those conversations is to basically become a patron. We really need the support of people to keep going and providing this content. So consider our Patreon, and I'll put those notes in the show notes below for you. But anyway, like, so leading thoughts, Spencer, like, I'm sure you did the same thing as me and you reviewed both of them. What kind of bubbled up in your mind?
To me, the whole thing just reaffirmed this. It's been in the background and slowly stewing since like around the time we started this podcast. But like listening to both of those, and then periodically bumping into normal people who are worried about like normal things, and how like there's like a huge gap between the types of stuff that Rao and Cutrone are concerned about and even what normal people that think they're interested in politics are thinking about. And I'm just accepting that I'm this sort of monkish hermit type person who I care about these things, but I think I've been laboring under the delusion that caring about these things will add up to some sort of change in the world, and I'm increasingly doubting that, which isn't to say I think it's useless or not worthwhile, but that's a long way to say it all makes me feel very melancholic, I think.
Does it make you feel kind of small in the grand scheme of things? Is that part of what you're feeling? Like,
Partly, yeah.
mm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Not entirely, but partly. And also, I have like a melancholic temperament, so there's probably a sense in which I'm just projecting my own preponderance of black bile, or however the theory goes, onto politics and onto history.
Black bile, that sort of sounds like medieval medicine time. Hildegard von Bingen might be helpful, but I don't know, like I I hear what you're saying. Both of these guys are theorists of a type. Both of them are longer view types, so they're taking this big step back, right? And especially Cutrone being a Marxist, he's looking at like the vast sweep of human history, and he sees all of
Right,
this.
dude.
Rao too, yeah. Maybe I think Cutrone a bit broader. He takes in more, I think,
I
because he
disagree.
feels, huh?
I disagree, but go ahead.
Okay, you can tell me why in a sec, but like I'm thinking Cutrone deals with, centuries of economic development, technological development, political developments, and how all of that feeds into what happened in the mid 19th century and beyond. So, and when I listen to Rao kind of seemed to exclude the economic and technical as like he didn't exclude them as in the conversation, but as like sources of the change. Because I thought that Rao was focusing more on he's more of an idealist in the sense of people make decisions or people want this or people decide that and they make this mistake. What makes you say that Rao is about similar when it comes to his scope?
Because I don't think people I don't think anybody is either an idealist or a realist. They might conceive of themselves in those terms, but and granted, I've listened to more Rao than just our interview, so I have and I'm more predisposed to. We've talked about temperamentally. I'm more predisposed to bend over backwards to try and charitably interpret somebody and fill gaps in their arguments that they don't.
Mm,
I don't, where there's a kernel of truth is, yeah, he does tend to think that politics and culture flow from our ideas and our cult. But I don't think he would admit that there's some sort of dialectical relationship that once we've made a world of factories and trains, that does further condition us to think along sort of uh, Catholic exclusionary and sort of Promethean lines. I don't think he would not deny. So, put another way, he's not denying that the material to some extent conditions our consciousness.
okay. Yeah, it probably does benefit you to have listened to more of Rao. I do remember him saying at one point, making a comment about I forget the word he used, but sort of like the dark satanic mills type of comment about, these things happened and then in a way he was conscious of the reaction to those things. But I'll take you.
And Cutrone is not like somehow not an idealist. I mean, when you really push him, he hits you with like this kind of Hegelian or this post-Hegelian dogma.
Mm,
Is
hmm.
that realism? I don't think so.
Yeah, you can see in the way he even looks when he communicates that he does have like there's the theoretical commitments, but there's also like the conviction that he can make or that he's trying to make change happen that's contrary to those trends. So I can see your point. Do you want to spend a little bit of time because the way that you started out was really interesting. Like basically, not where I think you would have started out. You basically said that both of these guys in their theoretical lens and the way that they deal with this bigger picture, I guess, the theoretical way of looking at human history. And you said most people will never think that way and don't want to, right? Or don't want to are not going to be like responsive to that. And that apparently you kind of experienced being on one end of that, thinking that, studying these things would sort of help you to make a difference. And now you're thinking maybe they don't. Is that what I heard?
I think so. Or at least I'm having a crisis of faith that these things matter. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's super interesting because it is like a perennial issue with theorizing. On the one hand, you can see if I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't say otherwise. If you look at the vast sweep of human history, major ideas have like totally changed the way people live, what they believe, how they work, and so on. We can't deny that, right? Um, but a lot of times those ideas kind of get taken up and become powerful, partly because of the material circumstances that are going on at that time. And so there's the synergistic, relationship. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think it's wrong to say that they don't have any impact because they've clearly at certain times in human history had enormous impact. Um, studying them, perhaps studying them is always valuable in my view because it expands you you as a person and your consciousness, and also your readiness, I guess. Um, but we're living in times, I guess you could argue, where the material circumstances don't seem to be right for enough people to grab hold of a new set of ideas. Or, well, maybe we're living in times when Trumpy folks are actually doing that. But like,
What people?
um, I use the term Trumpy, but like the
I do
sort.
I do not agree, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's the closest thing I can think of to kind of like a quasi mass movement going on in our own country right now that's largely like not led though by any coherent um philosophy. And but
It is led by a coherent philosophy.
what it is?
I think so.
Okay, well, who is providing that?
Like who, like what one person's providing it? I don't think any one person.
Well, okay, like normally one person or a group of people actually kind of like, John Locke, right? Sort of crystallized the thinking of the bourgeois revolutions.
Yeah.
And right, so like it kind of is the way I think anyway, like to find an argument, you have to find an argument made by a person.
Yeah, it's still John Locke. It's still whatever. I mean, it's too crude to put it that way, but there's a direct I've accepted the whole retarded argument is a straight line from Locke. For the Trumpian people, there is a taken for granted notion of bourgeois right from Locke through Washington and Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, even up, I would argue, through like FDR and Eisenhower. And now they feel aggrieved because their American dream is gradually turning into a nightmare. And they're right to sense that we are increasingly living in a nightmare. Or at least I think closer to the truth is that like modernity is a time of extremes. So every day we're getting closer to better times and worse times. And the cognitive dissonance of all this stuff, the Dust Bowl, is unbearable. But at least we have a narrative of rallying together for our bourgeois rights. And hence I hear like in certain like Republican circles, people are wearing like 1776 shirts again.
Yeah, this has been
And
going on for a while. As
right. And,
70s probably. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of an iteration of that to a certain extent, but it has new elements of nationalism.
no,
It's got
nationalism is not new, even in the
well,
Southern American
it's
sense.
new elements of nationalism in if we are to separate out the actual ideology that you're talking about, because nationalism does not go with liberalism. It's
I
the
disagree.
like the
I
international opposite.
disagree.
Well, okay, so it's either free market or it's protectionism,
Nope.
right? So,
Nope.
okay,
Both.
fine.
All the time. Coexisting extremes.
But
But
theoretically, they are contradictory. That's all I'm saying.
uh,
I grant you that they've existed kind of side by side. And okay, maybe this is the latest weird iteration of this,
mhm.
but
The contradictory nature of capitalism and liberalism has always been nation states and internationalism.
okay, we just can't call that pure liberalism then,
Sure.
because it's not. But like, sure, in the American context, we've had the two kind of coexist. Um, is
From
this
from the very beginning.
so? I guess what I was thinking was this is a mass of people that is dissatisfied. They feel like as you said, their life is changing and it's kind of under assault, and their freedoms are being threatened, and they want their jobs and they want their religion respected and all of that,
Some
some
of
of
them.
which is
And
liberal and some of which isn't.
and if we're being maximally charitable, I think they're more worried about their children and grandparents' future or grandchildren's future than like their own.
Having known many of them, I would say no, but like fine. I mean, I don't know all of them, but the ones that I do know and am familiar with don't think about as much about their kids and their future as you would think.
That's
Or
fair enough.
do it only very narrowly, as in, oh, I hope they can have a job, or I hope that they can, that I have money to give them when I die. But they don't think about like the quality of their life or their environment. We know that. They're not thinking about that at all.
Well, because pure liberalism requires excluding those considerations now.
Yeah, and they're
So,
not thinking about their education because it's very narrow, or they try to make it more narrow because they don't trust their kids.
right,
Um,
right,
but
but it's that very narrowness of education that allows them to hold on to this parochial Anglo-American political ideal
yeah,
in kind of vague sense. But that's why I insist there is a political philosophy. It is more or less coherent, and it is very historically precedented.
okay, I would agree that there is a political philosophy. I disagree that it's coherent. I think it's really stupid
Yeah.
and yeah,
Well, that makes
uninformed, but it's there. But and I guess to go back to what I was trying to say earlier, if there was like somebody in this mix who actually had a coherent set of ideas and could lead, this thing could become a real revolutionary force. But there is no such person. There's no one person or one group of people that's actually creating a coherent, motivating philosophy. So what we've got is people who are like, I thought America was one way and it's not, right? But they don't know
and now
exactly what's wrong and they don't know what to do about it.
sure. Right. And that's why American politics is the like filthy bathroom that it is because it's just a giant mess. And that's where the real, again, you run into people and they're back at like, oh, Trump or Biden. And it's like, even if you want to think that way, I think the real question is in 28, 32, 36. I don't know when. It's really Kanye versus Buttigieg or something like that. To me, that's the only somewhat way to have that kind of, that's what the future looks like, I think.
Isn't, in a way, wouldn't Kanye versus Buttigieg be kind of just another iteration of Biden versus Trump?
Just more extreme.
Yeah, even
Yeah.
crazier. I mean, we're going into like um the sort of like type of governments that you might associate with Latin America, right? The authoritarian, kind of wacky, the charismatic leader, left or right, that like, I don't know. It's kind of like going into idiocracy. That's kind of what's happening here.
So this made me think, I went back like many episodes ago. I referred to this book by John Rao, Removing the Blindfold, 19th Century Catholics and the Myth of Modern Freedom. And then after re-listening to it, I picked it up again and started reading. And I wanted to read a section.
Okay.
It's like a page and a half, but it's really good. And it is adjacent to this whole discussion.
Okay.
For people that have it in print, it's page 66, section D, and it's titled The Historical Overlapping of Ideas and the Confusion Caused by the Role of the Illogical in the Revolution. And since Rao is in the like Catholic counter-revolutionary tradition, when he talks about the revolution with a capital R, he's talking about everything from Luther and Calvin, although he'll admit that there were antecedents even before then. But he's talking about everyone from Luther and Calvin on through the Enlightenment, on through Marxism, and now he would argue it would include like the woke left, the new left. So what does Luther have in common with college kids on college campuses? Chanting from the river to the sea. That's what he means by the revolution. It is in this broader 500, 600 year sweep.
All right.
So back to the historical overlapping of ideas and the confusion caused by the role of the illogical in the revolution. Here we go. History, as we have already noted, is not the product of ideas alone. It is the product of ideas that are worked upon by men. Human motivations can be logical and illogical, good and bad, consciously known and unconscious, varied in the extreme. Even when some ideas are logically developed in history, the manner in which they are packaged and the hopes with which they are invested can often be very odd and illogical indeed. It is important to emphasize in this context that history is filled with examples of people seizing upon some new idea while retaining older beliefs and ways of behavior that contradict that concept fundamentally. Indeed, older ideas and the consequences drawn from traditional beliefs and ways of behavior very often exercise their fullest influence in their most developed form precisely when their sun has begun to set, or their greatest challenge has emerged. It sounds very Hegelian, like the owl of Minerva flying at dusk. But hence, a society struck by a new idea cannot be said to be the product of that new concept alone, or sometimes even at all. Neither can the first promoters of a new belief necessarily be said to have expected or desired all its future consequences. They, after all, were themselves formed by already existing concepts, lifestyles, and expectations. Yes, the logic of a new idea will run its course, but mixed together with older perceptions and desires that could well blind the very people responsible for its launch to its further rational development. This, according to the Civiltà, which was that Jesuit journal that he loved so much, was precisely what happened with Protestantism. Its quote-unquote new idea appeared in European society amidst the ever more complete development of older Catholic beliefs and ways of behavior. Events of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century therefore reflected Catholic as well as Protestant influence, even if it was the new approach of the heretic and his quote-unquote enlightened heir that made the great splash in people's minds. A Luther or a Calvin, and one could also say a Locke or a Voltaire, cannot automatically be assumed to have foreseen or willed or caused the precise future development of the revolution in all its characteristics. In many realms, they too continue to speak and act based on residual Catholic influences over them. Ironically, they also often taught and lived under the presumption that Catholic ideas continue to shape others, however much in principle they might condemn such an influence. In other words, the type of man they figured into their calculations was formed by medieval Catholic Europe. They could not predict how their calculation would be affected when men were truly formed by their own revolutionary ideas and institutions. The logic of the new idea promoted by the Protestant Reformation and then by the Enlightenment proceeded apace. It did so, however, in an illogical alliance with remnants of Catholic convictions, perceptions, expectations, and desires that it could not really support but presumed would nevertheless somehow continue. The presence of Catholic remnants within a revolutionary environment caused a confusion for those living within it that cannot be overemphasized. Revolutionaries who claim to want to achieve truly revolutionary goals are held back by Catholic habits that they may not even recognize as such. Those among them who retain Catholic desires may attribute the good deriving from Catholic ways of behavior to the revolutionary ideals that actually destroy them. Catholic words Catholic words may be given revolutionary meanings, while Catholics are seduced by the revolutionary co-option of their language to work towards anti-incarnational goals. They may come to attribute the good Catholic desires they wish to fulfill to revolutionary ideas, and then adopt revolutionary modes of behavior that render such desires impossible of fulfillment. The permutation of the confusion are endless. Generations had to pass before less involved observers, I love that phrase, less involved observers, could separate the two influences, and by then they saw that the mass of the population was so trapped in the danse macabre, their union together engendered, as to be utterly indifferent to the whole question of understanding them in the first place. The revolution, therefore, is a complexity. It is at once both logical and non-rational, or both logical and irrational. If one ignores its intellectual side, one fails to see its true direction. If one ignores its non-rational side, one fails to understand the confusion by means of which it has successfully proceeded. The merit of the Civiltà, and of Tapparelli in particular, was that they pointed out both factors clearly, the one theological and philosophical, the other historical, sociological, and psychological, so that students might grasp the disaster destroying the progress of mankind.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think he's right that, yeah, I mean, revolutionary ideas or any ideas, when they hit people, definitely get distorted and move in directions that were never intended by the proposers, and they get out of control. I think that's partly what he's saying there. I did not hear a whiff of materialism or any observation about economics or technology in that entire paragraph. I'm not saying he doesn't have it, but I didn't hear. I was kind of listening for that, and I'm not saying that he is wrong. I'm just saying, like, in order to get a complete picture, I still think that you have to account for the material and economic and technological um, things that are going on in people's lives. And what he's talking about is ideas and how they get distorted and which is all true. So,
I I
I,
have a but
mhm.
you're not entirely wrong. But when he says human motivations can be logical and illogical, good and bad, consciously known and unconscious, varied in the extreme. When he says illogical influences and unconscious influences, that can certainly include bourgeois material considerations, I would argue.
You would have to inject it. And all I'm saying is
I
the
am.
you are injecting it. See, that's different from saying that he says it, right? And all I'm saying is the Cutronian, position of he's going to take into account the material forces that are existing at a particular time is a good thing to splice into what Rao does.
And vice versa, because I
Yeah,
basically am convinced by his argument that if you don't have some sort of robust theological and ontological um, view of how things are, then you're going to have the reverse problem where you think it's all material, and then somehow or other, by everything being material, one day people are going to be truly free.
right. That would be a mistake too. Yeah, right.
So, so I will grant it is a weak point in Rao's argument, but Cutrone, I think, has the reversed weak point.
I agree. I agree. That's why both of them are important to listen to and to learn from. But the melding of the two, which neither one of them would probably approve of, is more useful, and I feel like that's what we've been doing the past few years as we've learned a little bit more about Marx and just economics generally, is not to like embrace it full stop and become materialists, but rather to like receive what is actually important in that way of thinking, and then to use that to develop thinking like Rao's in a way that's more, I guess, more realistic or more like true, because it covers more of reality. I think both positions make a mistake in not acknowledging the other and not incorporating it. But like you pointed out a while ago, I mean, in practice, Cutrone kind of operates like most Marxists do in a way that does acknowledge, without it being spoken, the power of ideas. Because otherwise, they wouldn't be out there trying to propagate those ideas, right?
Sure.
Um, Nobody's a pure materialist in practice, but in theory, I think he would. Well, you may disagree. Like in theory, maybe he isn't either. Exactly. A
I
pure.
think we're always already both,
Mhm.
and we can try and suppress the one or the other, or
Right.
or have it be the background. But
I would suspect that Rao maybe subconsciously represses that. I doubt if he's doing it consciously. It's just that what's most important to him is how people have thought about religion and social matters. And maybe because of that, overemphasizes the power of ideas. Um, and I'm not even saying that he would benefit from like learning or like incorporating more of that, but we surely can. And that's what makes people uncomfortable about the Maurin Academy. If they're going to have you know, if they aren't attracted to us, or they come for a while and then they're like, ooh, it's not all Marx, or ooh, it's not all Catholicism, it's not all, you know, environmental stuff. And you know, I'm sure many people have left because something popped into their Patreon feed that disagreed with their worldview, and they were mainly here to get that. But when we put things like this together, I feel like we're making theoretical progress because it's necessary to do if we're going to think clearly, really clearly about these things. Not that, you know, maybe it doesn't matter, but I still tend to think it does.
and that's what I'm despairing of. I just want to read the sentence from towards the end of that again because I think it directly bears. Generations had to pass before less involved observers could separate the two influences, and by then they saw that the mass of the population was so trapped in the dance macabre their union together engendered as to be utterly indifferent to the whole question of understanding them in the first place.
Yeah, it almost describes who we are right now at this very moment.
Right. And then
And
it's in that dance. Well, what can critical mass of right-wing Americans hold on to? And it is some incoherent mix of the Bible and Locke and Jackson.
mhm. Which you can't really blame them for like grasping around at what's available, right? It's not like they, in our current degraded state, have access to a quality education or upbringing. I mean, most Americans were raised on television and the internet, right? And their schooling has been just continually degraded to the point where, you know, I mean, the fact that a lot of Americans are still somehow like able to even identify with the Bible or uh, the the American Revolution at all is kind of extraordinary. Um, there's there's potential there in that sort of grasping that is just not being uh, it's not being managed appropriately. And I suppose that's, you know, that's the morass. That's the image of the morass that we're in, is that no one can rise to that occasion who can get the attention of the public, and
Right.
minds are closed.
Right. And you need a charismatic demagogue that can like consolidate the lowest common denominator of their coalition, and that was Trump. And I'm still calling it. One day it's probably going to be Kanye.
Kanye or somebody like him. Yeah.
Right. I'm not saying it absolutely will, but I
Right.
can't any person on the national media landscape that has a better shot of being Trump's successor.
Right. And the problem with that, of course, is that, and it would just take a miracle if somebody much more with it than either Trump or Kanye, somebody who could kind of like take command and actually try to like bring order back to chaos actually would be it would be a miracle, a sort of benevolent intelligent Trump that could actually harness that. And that
But
only
that's the exact appeal of for the other half of the country that yearn for like a second Obama. And I'm using Buttigieg as an example. That what if we could have someone who theoretically is as demented as Biden, but we can feel good about and seems competent.
well, but I'm talking about somebody who's vastly superior to that. I mean, the only way that you could move the needle with this kind of mess is if you had a benevolent leader who was actually, not only highly intelligent but charismatic and, was not in it for the wrong reasons. I don't think a Buttigieg or another Obama fits that bill. I mean, they're ordinary politicians and, like they represent like the status quo. So Trump sort of, if sort of like granting you quite a bit of that argument, for a lot of people. I mean, he's somebody that people project their ideas onto clearly. So if you're religious, he's a Christian. If you're not, he's not. If you're a racist, he's a racist. But he's not if you're not. And, like if you're a capitalist and a free market guy, he's that. But if you want to protect your economy, he's also that. So he's got that sort of charismatic element of, bringing,
Bipartisan.
yeah, right. But he can't lead. He just,
But the purpose is not to lead. The purpose is to patch up the status quo and reconcile.
exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, right. But in these circumstances, if you had somebody emerge who actually could lead,
Mhm.
these are the times in which that could happen. That's what I'm saying.
Right. And I'm saying the reverse is also true. It's the times it could happen, but it's such because the times are getting increasingly desperate, it makes it actually even harder for this would-be Messiah to come along.
Right, this political savior. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, like where are they? The people who might have in the past risen to the occasion are running for the hills. They're all, and this is part of our world now, the way that people are conditioned by their society. It's like, circle the wagons. I'm going to quit politics, or I'm going to like step back and I'm just going to try to live my own life, right? Um, the people who are who might be able to do that, and I wouldn't even say that there are any, but they're running away.
Okay. Would you humor one more page from this book further along?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. We're jumping forward to section G, the revolutionary reduction of freedom to feeling, will, and force, page 78. Unfortunately, the Civilta insisted, the revolutionary can never be free. He cannot be free, and remember that revolutionaries in this very broad sense, to include basically all the Protestants. The revolutionary can never be free. He cannot be free because not just all the Protestants, all the Catholics that have internalized all these ideas. He
Mhm.
cannot be free because depriving himself of the supernatural aid of Christ continued. That's his term for the church, or the civilitas. The idea is like, since the church is the mystical body of Christ and the visible body, Christ continued. Depriving himself of the supernatural aid of Christ continued. And stressing the independence principle disguised as freedom, he quote unquote frees himself entirely from wisdom, from conscience, and from everything that would enable him to order his actions to a good and true end, everything making his actions really free ones. In the process, he enslaves himself to his willful passions, and inevitably to the dominion of the strongest feelings and wills around him, which operate on the basis of pure force. He makes, and again, I think there's a material implication of this, even if he doesn't spell it out to your satisfaction. He makes a theoretically untenable teaching of total depravity a freely cultivated practical reality. Revolutionary Protestantism can clearly be seen to encourage this development directly, in renouncing belief in free human action formed by wisdom, a belief which the ideal of total depravity renders impossible. Protestantism turns the world into a lion's den where everyone is at war with everyone else, and in which earthly behavior has no connection with man's eternal destiny. True, the original Protestants wanted the authorities to enforce God's law, which they argued could be known by faith alone. Still, they did so illogically, or we may say, because they were still half Catholics. The principle of independence, however, logically eats away at God's law, which no longer has the flesh and blood Church of Christ continued to confirm its value. Human psychology being what it is, a deposit of divine wisdom entailing a definite code of behavior having nothing to do with the meaning of life and enforced by authority alone, cannot long be taken seriously by anyone, especially when all belief in a supposedly irrational, unseen God disappears. Protestantism leaves nothing behind but disjointed, willful, warring men. It must dissolve all wisdom, and hence the very concepts of right and justice, leaving only force to keep the jungle of the universe under control. And then he has a quote from Taparelli that really just kind of reiterates. All right, one more paragraph. Revolutionary Protestantism directly kills the idea of freedom built on wisdom and hence on notions of right and justice. But once again, historically speaking, it has generally had this effect indirectly through the Enlightenment, whose devotees wanted men to be independent and free of God, but not of reason. They wanted the logic of the independence principle to cease after the restraints of the church, the corporate authorities, and perhaps the state also had been destroyed. They wished to preserve those imposed by the mind. They could not succeed in this, and they also ushered in the reign of will and force. And then, anyway, he goes on.
Okay.
But I mean, I think he's right. Like, this kind of traditionalist view sure explains a lot of the incoherence and insanity in the world, I think.
Well, he's definitely right about the unintended consequences of the Reformation. Um, yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's a tragedy, right? And it spun out in all these different directions, and it led to attitudes towards the world. I mean, there's an area where the materialism and the whatever we want to call it that he's doing intersect, which is that as these Protestants emerged, they emerged in the background of a new kind of merchant class that was developing new ways of making money, less respect for aristocracy and authority. And then the Protestant teachings kind of like got taken up by, even though they weren't intended as such by the reformers so much, especially Luther. But pretty quickly, because of that context and just because of the way people are, they become, justifications for just making money or, treating property in a very absolute manner, property rights and the kind of gross individualism that develops where, because of partly because of Protestant teaching and partly because of these material conditions becomes this very narrow, me and my rights as an individual. So, yeah, yeah,
Right. And now fast forward to you own a house in the suburbs and inflation keeps on going and your job keeps not keeping pace with that. And you don't have any yourself, you probably don't have any productive assets. And even if you did, the idea that you could leverage those productive assets to in the MCM circuit.
mm-hmm.
So we're all in this situation where capital is gradually, the centrifuge of capital most people feel is sucking more away than it's giving.
Yeah.
And there's still a cultural holdout from a period where the reverse was true. The capital was giving the majority of people more than it was taking from them, the majority of people in America, because it was
Hmm.
sucking resources from the rest of the world. So then you have like our consciousness lagging behind the material conditions.
Right. And part of what's going on there, and this plays into the changes in religion wrought by many, circumstances, but the Protestant trend for sure in this country is that, in previous, but when people were, living, or at least a certain type of person was living like fairly well in America, let's say in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Okay. Um, People lived so much simpler and with less. And their idea of prosperity was our idea of poverty. Their idea of like a starter home would be our idea of a hovel. They didn't buy a bunch of, stuff. And when that started to happen, um, money got sucked up everywhere, and now, we most of our income is going out in the form of, mortgage payments forever, car payments, services payments, consumables, eating out. And so now the person, there's a reason why, Americans often say you can't like operate a household on one income. Is because they want so much. Why do they want so much? Partly, well, because the whole economy tells us this is what life is, right? And why has that become so predominant? Probably partly due to the developments of Protestantism that fed into that way of thinking, and I almost identified material wealth with God's favor. So all of that, is like
Sure.
in the mix.
Right. Right. And I adjacent to all that, there isn't an arrangement between church and state that provides any kind of means to help people reconcile some degree of self-sacrifice to the rest of the whole.
Right. Yeah.
Our desires are infinite, or at
There's,
least we perceive our desires to be infinite, and we know they're socially limited. And then how do you reconcile those two things?
I wonder, I mean, since we're kind of dwelling on the idea side of the equation in this particular podcast, I sometimes wonder, and I used to do a lot of research on honor and kind of manliness and things like this, and I sometimes wonder how much traction you could get by just like continually pointing out how like lacking in independence and how lacking in know-how and how like spoiled and soft like a lot of Americans are, where now we have the godly man in this big McMansion, um, not doing a dang thing, doesn't know how to fix anything, doesn't know how to, grow any food, doesn't know how to take care of himself. Okay, trying to make enough money to like educate his kids in rarefied, homeschool or, religious school spots where they can be protected from dealing with the material realities of the world and so on and so forth. I mean, it's it's kind of shameful, not just the way they live, but like the way an awful lot of people live where they have no idea like how to take care of themselves, right? So I wonder if sometimes wonder if just pointing out how like soft and vulnerable this way of life has made people might snap them out of it. The same people who go around with the, my guns or whatever are living this kind of like,
I think a lot of those people are aware of I'm not going to say they all are, but baked into the quote unquote Trumpian cake is, um, I think a sense of people's emasculation and like an attempt to try and like be masculine and independent. That's
yeah,
part of the
it's
whole deal.
yeah, you're right. It is. It's just that it's so distorted, like masculinity. Or, and if we're going to kind of like be more broad, there is a way that you can kind of see emasculation as applying to both men and women. There's a sort of like just a weakening and sort of like dependency, right, that's developed. But the way that it's come out in that in our culture is I'm going to now be hyper masculine, hyper feminine, but in doing that, they aren't actually necessarily, it's style without substance. Like there's no there behind it, like the man who's a godly leader, what's he really doing? Like, can he actually take care of business? He can make a paycheck, okay, but is he actually like leading his family religiously or in any other way? What are those kids really doing? Like, I, so there's like this yearning, but it's become detached from actual doing in a major way, it seems like.
Maybe. I mean, I'm sure there are people all over the place that are more or less succeeding, given the context, in doing more than what you're saying they're doing.
Well, sure. I'm sure there are. Um, but, stepping back from,
But I mean, but also when the oven is hot enough, all the cakes are going to be half baked. Like,
right. Yeah. I mean, I think it does express a yearning for um, more mastery over ourselves and our environment than we currently have. It
mhm,
just looks really distorted.
sure. Well, and there's a whole theoretical question of what does mastery look like? And does it, I feel like part of what we're doing, like at a theoretical level, is we're like on a tightrope over an abyss, which makes sense why most people don't want to have anything to do with us. And it's like have you seen those like bars that tightrope walkers use to like help balance sometimes?
Yeah.
It's like, at least just speaking for myself, I'm like holding these two poles of I'm entertaining these like very far right traditionalist ideas, like so far right they're like pre-modern.
Hmm.
And then, but what if Cutrone's right? And the line from at least Kant to Hegel, and Rao would vote from Luther to Hegel to Cutrone. What if nature is all just flux and freedom is just sort of the accumulation of power for an individual to self-determine, and nothing is true, everything's permitted. Now, there's a lot about that view I don't like, but it sure seems like we live in a world where that ideal is closer to becoming a reality, at least for the elites, than that we could have a holistic neo-medieval society. And
Right.
and part of where we're in this miscarried interregnum is we're living in this world. Part of the fascination of people like Bezos and Musk's is they at least are close enough to that left-wing ideal that they can at least imagine that they might be gods.
Hmm. They do have vision. Yeah, they do have vision, especially seems like Bezos, but and it is somewhat, it's a weird combination of sort of wanting to keep the economy like growing, but at the same time taking care of the planet and people. And it's so like it's huge, actually. Um, I don't know.
And that's the incoherence. They want to constantly be accelerating, but they don't want to do so at the expense of the principle.
Right. Endless growth. And for most people, to kind of go back to the freedom point, I think you rightly stated we're living in a world where the rich person can kind of say, or at least aspire to say, I can be and do whatever I want, and there is no real truth. It's just being what I want to do, what I want to do today. Um, and of course, that attitude kind of ripples down to the society, and in much lesser ways, the people below them try to kind of obtain the same thing through, we have like a very strong like emphasis on, I guess, the quest for identity in our society now. And I would include things like, from people that make their hair purple one day and red the next, to tattoos, to like, that kind of stylistic stuff, all the way to, the exploration of all aspects of gender, and just like all these different ways that people are trying to not conform. I think that, but I mean, you know, they they're trying to do this in their own way, but it doesn't seem to amount to much. It doesn't, they aren't as free. I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but they're not as free to really become masters of their environment. So instead, they try to become masters of a very small micro environment, and that's kind of like the reflection of what Bezos is doing. I don't know. Am I making sense at all?
I think so. Well, and I think part of the definition of pure liberalism, like the foundational level, is a belief that it's my body, my choice.
Hmm. Right.
That expresses itself with abortion. It expresses itself with people's gender, what they want to dye their hair, even like to what their career is. And if we're up on that tightrope, what both Rao and Cutrone, although they'll both be they'll nuance this, but at a fundamental way, what they're both saying is it's not your body, your choice. That they both have used the word social individual.
Hmm.
So
Right.
the contention is the individual, while either under a hypothetical like Leninist world government, where the state's withered away, or in like a holistic Catholic, a neo Christendom, the individual will have rights and actually will have more potential for self realization than we currently have under this kind of miscarried liberalism. But also, it will have done so by being um, sublimated to some degree into the surrounding society, which to liberals sounds like authoritarianism, collectivization, um, and
Yeah.
it doesn't. Or at least if you take their theory on its own terms, it will be and it won't.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Both of them are envisioning more, and that more is actual society, actual like
Mhm.
social growth and social cohesion. And that is, you know, very, very difficult for people to even conceive now because of how like fragmented we are. And so, yes, the reaction is, oh my gosh, like you're going to take away my freedom. But there is a way in which we can't move past this morass of flailing about, trying to find some sort of meaning in life, unless we, who are social beings, can actually recreate society, right? I mean, we really had the fragmenting and the sort of disintegration of society going on here, which has been, very supported by this economy that just allows you to like kind of hive yourself. If you've got any money, the more money you've got, you can sort of hive yourself off from other people and the consequences of, having to deal with them. So if we can get beyond that, we would then have something that we have like been truly desiring, I think, which is belonging and purpose and meaning. That's what people are missing from this equation right now. And with that belonging, then you have that social power, which could make everybody's lives more secure and better, right? But it would change our values, right? We wouldn't be like, how do I get a bigger McMansion? Or, how do I like, I want to get that next, I want to get the new iPhone or whatever it is that people are thinking they want.
Or in a best case scenario, how do I run an enterprise that generates capital for myself and for the surrounding world?
Right, yeah. Like how do I take into account the social needs?
Yeah. Well, but
Like,
that's at its best, liberalism and capitalism claim to do that.
but they don't really, right? Well, you probably will disagree, but like the way I've always seen that is that the liberalism in theory just doesn't hardly account for society at all. It erases society. The people who embraced it, and even the theorists themselves, didn't see the full antisocial implications of that theory. They just sort of assumed that people would always be social in nature. They never imagined that it would, slowly erode that capacity.
Right. Which is where exactly what Rao was saying, that they took uh, a sacramentalized and supernaturalized population as natural.
Right, right, right.
And then instead of it was like the fruit of Christendom, it was like the root of a new society. And we can just do away with the old thing. And, that was in the interview with Rao, that was his critique of John Courtney Murray, that basically it was like in the traditional telling, Vatican II was basically a recapitulation of this mistake, that the majority of the bishops on what they signed off on and sort of the view that came out of it, what's sometimes called the spirit of Vatican II, was confusing what Catholicism had made people into for what people just are. And if we can just shave off the residual Catholicism, they'll be even better.